Good morning. Lovely to see everyone here. It's wonderful to be here on this beautiful Labor Day. And I don't know what to expect on Labor Day weekend because people are here, there, and yon. But 8 o'clock was robust, and this is robust too. So delighted to see you. So when I was growing up as a child, I remember this thing. I'm surprised I remember this, but I remember learning how to set the table. I remember my mom teaching me how to set the table, not in any kind of ornate or fancy way with a lot of detail, but just the basics. Which side the napkin went on, how the silverware was arranged, outside in, fork on the left with the napkin, spoon and knife on the right. Such simple little things, but I've never forgotten them. And it stood me in good stead all these years, and I remember it. So I've set plenty of tables and been asked to set plenty of tables, but I knew the basics. So today in the gospel lesson, Jesus is talking about the basics of setting the table too. But he's talking about it in a different way, and to be honest, things are a little trickier than just remembering what side the napkin goes on. Because in this case, the things that he's saying involve people and the decisions that they make or don't make. And inevitably, the things he's saying kind of push up against the edges. And he's been doing that a lot lately. If you've been in church, we've been talking about Sabbath regulations and Jesus kind of pushing the edges of those, especially with the religious leaders, pushing them to see things through this lens of compassion and not get caught up in a lot of other things. And so here today, he's pushing the edges again when he tells this parable about a wedding banquet. So let's just take a moment to notice that Jesus is invited into the Pharisees' home. So he's welcome to be there. It is like he is on the outside of the inside of that world, but he's a part of that world. And even though he's a part of that world, they have their eyes on him, because he's been saying things that rub them the wrong way. But he does get this world. And so he sits down at that banquet that he's been invited to, and he tells a parable about a wedding banquet. And it says, we just went over the sentence, but it says at the dinner that Jesus was at, people were sitting at the places of honor. And then immediately he turns to this parable. So you can sort of imagine how that's going to go over, because he's speaking right to the people who sat in the places of honor. And he says, I got a story to tell you. So he tells this parable. He talks about a wedding banquet where lots of important and influential people are invited. The tables are set. They've pulled out all the stops. The guests are there and they're milling about. And pretty soon it's time to eat. And some of those guests go straight for the best seats in the house, the places of honor. Others mill about a little bit more and take the seats farther out. Maybe that's because they didn't think they should sit forward at all, or maybe those were only the seats that were left, but they seem not to care as much. It's helpful to know in these days, even more so than now, but I still think it's true now, that banquets and big dinners like this, they were symbols of status, where the host could show off their wealth and their extravagance. And others saw them as places where they could come and hobnob, not just for fun, but also to make connections, to sort of rub shoulders with the powerful people. And in its own little circle with the Pharisees, this is what's going on too. And you get a taste for this if you've ever been to Pompeii, with the Roman ruins. You get a taste for how this all laid out when you just see villa after villa after villa with these extravagant mosaics on the floor, the remains of them, frescoes painted on the walls in these villas, and there are multiple of them, and they're just one after the other. Some of them have elaborate systems of running water built on the backs of slaves. There are giant fountains and many where the courtyard would be when you would walk into the villas. So these are very fine places. And you go do your tours of different ones, and you'd always notice that off to one side was a very tiny space, not even a space where you could hardly lay down. And that was where the slaves or servants would be during the banquet. That's where they were. They never ate in the house or in the villa. And what was so interesting to me is if you go and walk through the squares of Pompeii, every couple of blocks, there were these interesting sort of open air, it wasn't really a cafeteria, but it was the equivalent of that because they had like giant holes where huge vats would go, like 3 huge vats, and they were over some kind of heat. And you would see these every couple of blocks. They were open to the street. And that was where the workers or the enslaved would go to get a bite to eat. And if they were lucky, their master would give them a couple of coins to take down there. But that's where they ate. Those were sort of the gathering spot. It probably wasn't much to eat, but those were ever present because those people never ate in the homes. And it's into this sort of context that Jesus is speaking. Like these villas were for the beautiful people, the people with influence, the people with power. And so the host comes in this parable, and he says to the people who've taken the seats of honor, and imagine if you're one of those Pharisees who sat in the seats of honor as you're listening to this, the host comes and he says to them, go to the back. And he says to those who didn't take the seats of honor, he said, friends, come forward, take your place. So notice that he commands to one group, he commands them, he tells them, go to the back. And to the other one, he says, friends, come forward, take your place. Why would that be in the parable? The point Jesus is making clear is that in God's kingdom, honor does not come from self-aggrandizing or from angling or from thinking even just first about yourself, taking the best seat in a metaphorical way. That's not where we find our honor in God's kingdom, and in fact, it's quite the opposite. Those who lose their lives for my sake will save them, will find them. Those who wash the feet of others at the table, those I call friends. Now, I was thinking about that. I was like, well, why would the host call them friends? Is that because the people who sat in their chairs, is that because they somehow earned it? Did they earn being called friends by just going to the right seat, by doing the right thing? Is that why they get to be called friends? Or is it something else? And I wonder if they're called friends because the host has some connection with them. They get it. They get that it's okay to sit at the back. They don't have to angle for the front. And so because they get it, they have this intimate connection with the host who thinks that way too. Those others who take the places of honor, they're going to have to work to understand this because they're striving, they're trying to assert their place and compete with all the others. But those who are just milling about and who don't care, they're not worried about it because you know what? They know that there's a seat for everyone in the house. They can live off that. They know they are loved, they're going to be held, they were invited to the party after all. Why would there not be a seat? And they are able to live into that. And so they're called friends because the host knows that. The host knows they've set a seat for everyone at the banquet table. So if you liken that to how God welcomes us, we all have a seat at the banquet table. There's no need to have to strive or to angle because we know it's sort of our baseline that we are welcome and that we have a place at the table. And so for those who are milling about, who aren't worried about it, maybe they're just free. They're free in their core because they know they're held, they know they have a seat, they're free in their spirit. There's a great quote by Howard Thurman, an African-American mystic who wrote a lot in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and I keep this on my desk. And it kind of gets out what I'm talking about, and here's how it goes. And you have to sort of imagine the context in which he's writing this before the Civil Rights Movement. He says, there is in every person an inward sea, and in that sea there is an island, and on that island there is an altar. And standing guard before that altar is the angel with the flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority. Nothing passes the angel with the flaming sword to be placed upon your altar unless it be a part of the fluid area of your consent as a child of God. This is your crucial link with the eternal, knowing that you are held. I think that's what Jesus is really getting at in this parable. This intimacy that we're invited into with God, that we can know with God, when we trust in our core who we are and whose we are. And so all that striving in whatever way isn't needed. It doesn't have to be at a banquet and finding the seat of honor. It's just all the worries we have about belonging and whether we fit. All that worrying about where we stand or whatever others think of us, it doesn't matter because we know we are held in Christ. We know we're already home before we've even begun the journey. We're already friends. That's what Jesus is driving at in that parable. And so then we come to the second part of our gospel lesson. If Jesus hasn't, incensed the people at the table, or at least had their eyes on him even more, he just sort of drives the knife in even harder. Because he turns to the person who's invited him to the table and he says, when you're having a banquet, don't invite all the people you would normally think to invite, like me. Don't invite anyone that you would think, like your families, your friends, your fellow religious leaders, your neighbors, your social or work acquaintances. He says, no, instead, go outside your usual world. Even go all the way to the edge. For the Pharisees, this meant welcoming the poor, the cripple, the lame, the blind in their day. They never would have had a place at the table with the Pharisees, or even in their religious communities. They were on the outskirts. And so when I read this, I think, what does that mean for us? Who do we invite here, and how do we invite them? How do we welcome people? Just take a moment and think about that. Jesus says, start there and you'll find the kingdom. So last Wednesday, there's a great example of this. It was the feast day of Thomas Gaudet, an Episcopal priest, mid to late 19th century. And he's remembered because the Episcopal Church has this very active ministry to people who are deaf. And it all began with him because he helped found schools and churches and Bible studies for the deaf and the mute back when there was nothing, no resources at all. There was not sign language, there were no resources for them. And he says that his commitment to this all began when one day he was playing outside with a group of kids, with the other kids, and he noticed the neighbor, a girl who he knew was deaf, who couldn't hear, and she was off on the side playing by herself. So all the kids are having their time, and he noticed her off by the side playing by herself. And he went over and he just started playing with her. He didn't have any way to communicate with her, but he started drawing in the dirt these pictures of things that they would see, like a tree or a flower or a plant. And then he would write out the letters so that she could see what the letters were that corresponded with the picture of whatever it was around them. And they had this connection. They were able to communicate. They had communion. This was the kingdom, and it was that encounter that shaped his entire life's working and calling. That's going out to the edge and looking and seeing with new eyes who's there and finding ways to make communion with them. And to be honest, we don't really have to go to the farthest edge. Maybe it's just about thinking about something in a new way. And last Sunday, we experienced that here when we invited the children. I don't know if y'all were here at the service last Sunday, but it was sort of family-focused, and Mary played the guitar, and we invited all the children. The children had the blessing of the backpacks. And then right after that, we just did this little tweak. We invited the kids to come sit in the choir pews for the announcements. and then to come stand at the altar rail for the Eucharistic prayer, and then they were the very first to take communion. Now that took a little courage. You're kind of a wild and woolly group, and you can only do so much, and it's a small space, and here they are. They're having a good time, but we thought, we're just going to try this. We're going to see how this works. A little thing, a little tweak, thinking about our liturgy in a different way and our communion in a different way, but it was beautiful because those kids were front and center at our banquet feast, and they knew it. They knew it in a visceral way, not by telling them, oh, you're important and you're front and center, but they knew it because here they were standing and they could see. They probably don't know that. I mean, they know they belong, but when they're peeking over a pew or when they're sitting in the balcony, so the parents who are mortified that they're going to make noise can sort of make an easy exit. It's an unstated message, but this is a very bold message. Like, you are welcome here. You can see everything that's happening. And some of them looked terrified, like they had come so close to the holy they didn't know what to do. Others weren't bothered at all. But I loved how I experienced it leading the Eucharistic prayer. I loved how the congregation experienced it watching it. And it changed, in that moment, our experience of communion and what that's about. And it was just a little thing, by thinking outside the box a little, trying something new, and seeing how it changes our experience of what's at the center of our worship. It's these new visions, these new ways of thinking about our community, about how we build community in all of our lives, that help us expand this vision of the kingdom. They help us begin to notice, to pay intentional attention on who might be on the outside, and to think creatively, like, how can we be in communion? How could I invite them? How could I experience or talk to someone different from me? And it reminds me of really how wide God's kingdom really is. It's so broad, it's beyond anything we can imagine. We have our ways of sort of setting the guardrails, but it's really broader than anything that we know. And when we experience that, when we see that, when we know that firsthand, when we taste it and when we know it, we're never the same, because it's manna from heaven for us, and we want more, and we want to think about how to do that. So I've got one last story to tell, sort of about going out to the edge to think about communion in a new way. And y'all probably know last spring or sort of late winter, a group of us went to Charleston on pilgrimage. And we went to Emmanuel AME there, and we met a man named Lee Bennett, who is a historian and archivist of Mother Emmanuel. And he talked to us on a tour, and we connected with him, and it was really a good time. And it stayed with us. It really stayed with us. And so one of the things I've been thinking about when we return from these pilgrimages is, how can this not be an event in itself, but how can we keep and continue our communion, the connections that we make along the way? And Elizabeth and I thought, maybe we'll invite Lee Bennett to come here in the fall to talk to the church, maybe for a weekend. What could that look like? We didn't even quite know what he would talk about. We had ideas. We didn't know if he would, want to in any way. And so Elizabeth sent an email to him, and she didn't hear back. And like a month or two went by, and I asked her, if she'd heard back from Lee, and she said no. And she said, but you know what? I'm going to call him again. I'm going to reach out to him. And so she did, and she set up this Zoom call that me and Elizabeth had with him in the spring. He'd never been asked before to come speak to a church, and he asked what we wanted him to talk about, and I just started riffing. Like, I'm not particularly sure, but stewardship of history is one idea I have, racial justice and reconciliation, Mother Emmanuel, and how you understand your history and identity and how you tell your story. And we had a great chat. And the good news is he is coming here in October, and it's going to be a wonderful weekend, and we've sort of built that communion going on. But where I'm going with this is, a couple of weeks ago, we had to talk to him about changing the date. So we called him. He was on speakerphone. He's a very reserved guy. I mean, he's chatty, but he's also reserved. And the phone call, we were sort of wrapping it up. And then there was a pause, and then he said, "Guess where I'm going this weekend?" And we're like, I don't know. And he said, "I'm getting ready to go up to Pennsylvania to the International Little League Baseball Championship," which was maybe 2 Sundays ago. And so the next question, of course, is, "Oh, what are you going to that for?" And he started to tell us about his dad, who is a 14-year-old in Charleston, had been part of the Cannon Street All-Stars Little League team, an African-American team from Charleston, from a poor area in Charleston, and they were like a Spitfire team. They were great. And they were so good that they won the opportunity to go to nationals. That's how good they were. And it was only to be told that they shouldn't come because they wouldn't be welcome. None of the white teams of kids didn't want to play with them. Now, I doubt that was the kids that didn't want to play with them. I suspect it was their parents. But so his father was part of this great baseball team, Little League baseball team, that didn't get to go. They never got to go. And you can imagine, or maybe we can't imagine, but the disappointment, the heartache. So this story comes full circle because this year Lee Bennett got a call from someone who was trying to find his father. They wanted to invite all the people on that team to come to the national championship and to be part of a ceremony and to honor them. Lee Bennett's father passed away, but he went to represent his father, and there were 12 or 13 other people still living who had been part of that team. And they were invited to come to this championship game, and before the game, there was a special ceremony. They were put up in a hotel, they were taken care of, they were the honored guests. And one of those guests, a friend of Lee Bennett's father, he's probably 90 years old or so, I watched this on TV, and they asked him, "Well, how is it being back?" And he said, "Well, you know, it's kind of hard to come back to something that you didn't get to have when you were a kid. It's a little bit hard to be here and know that that wasn't an opportunity you got." Then he said, "But you know what? I am so appreciated for I so appreciate being invited and being the guest at this. Just the way the circle can come back around and we can have reconciliation and hope for our world." This, for Jesus, is where healing begins, in those sorts of circles. Looking at those outside, unexpected places where there's hurt, where there have been those who haven't been seen or even thought to be asked how they feel about something, and then treating them as honored guests, not teaching them, but treating them as the people from whom we can learn, our honored guests. That's what the gospel is all about. That's what these parables are about. That's what Jesus' life was about. So go there and let's be there. Amen.
Amen.